Our guest today is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. She's an author. She's also an advocate for better preservation policies, bike lanes, and sustainable urban development. At the crux of everything, she's a writer and uses the power of the written word to raise awareness, drive change, and create accountability. Inga Saffron has witnessed the changing landscape of Philadelphia for 3 decades now, as a reporter, foreign correspondent, and architecture critic at the Philadelphia Inquirer. She often writes about preservation, most notably focusing on the African American history in Philadelphia and how cultural and historic preservation lock horns with urban planning. Today, we're doing a bit of role reversal, and I get to ask the questions. I am Vaissnavi Shukl, and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight radical perspectives and unconventional projects that reflect emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture Off Center is a labor of love. If you enjoy listening to the show, support us on Patreon so we can keep featuring exceptional people who are venturing into the unexplored frontiers of the built environment. You have witnessed the changing landscape of Philadelphia as a writer for over 2 decades, and you often focus on the topic of preservation. So I want to jump into it directly and talk about your series of writings, which I came across. These focus on the African American history in Philadelphia. There are 2 particular instances which come to mind. First is the Christian Street, or what you call the Black Main Street. And second is Yorktown, which was supposed to be Philadelphia's black suburb. You've talked about both these cases through the lens of preservation. Can we focus on these 2 examples and talk about the big history question? What is it that we're preserving? And more importantly, how do we deal with the multiplicity of histories, architecturally and otherwise? How do we know what is worthy of being preserved in Philadelphia?
Oh, okay. So that's a very big question, Vaissnavi. But first of all, thank you for having me on the show. I'm really pleased to be here, be part of this. So I guess I have to talk a little bit about Philadelphia and about American history. And I'm sure many of your listeners know that America has a long history, a long unfortunate history of segregation. When people of color, particularly African Americans, lived in circumscribed neighborhoods, they couldn't rent or buy homes in just any place. They were limited to where they could live. And often these were neighborhoods that were getting older and were being abandoned by white people. That's the unfortunate part of the history. But Philadelphia has a long, long history of African Americans going back to colonial times. And then during what we call the Great Migration, when a lot of Black people moved from the South to the industrialized North, they began settling in large numbers in Philadelphia in these limited areas where they were allowed to live. One of the things that happened, as often does, is, people developed their own very rich culture. And so this neighborhood that was known as the Black Main Street and Black Doctors Row was an incredibly vibrant Black neighborhood in the early 20th century. And it was quite beautiful, actually. Philadelphia is a brick city, red brick, and with townhouses, a bit like, parts of London. And a lot of these houses were built in the Victorian period in the late 19th century. And so this area just outside the center became a Black neighborhood. And there was everything you could want there, every profession. There were many, many churches, and there was a YMCA with a swimming pool and after school activities and grocery stores and butchers and, just every single thing a community could need. And that community actually did quite well, relatively speaking. And it also nurtured quite a few Black architects and engineers. And one of the most important early 20th century Black architect, a man named Julian Abel, lived in that neighborhood. He lived on this street. It's called Christian Street. Not because it was Christian, but it's named after someone's last name. But anyway, Julian Abel lived on this street. And he was an incredibly successful architect. He actually worked for a white-owned firm, and they designed the Philadelphia Museum of Art. They designed Philadelphia's library. He traveled extensively in Europe, and he made the Grand Tour and knew a lot about French architecture. He worked on Duke University and lots of houses for wealthy people. So he was very successful. Just a few doors down lived an engineer named Frederick Messiah, who emigrated from Jamaica. And he developed a construction method using reinforced concrete that was very novel at the time. There was another architect, a Black architect, who was married to a very famous singer, Marion Anderson. All sorts of interesting people. I mean, and it was at the time when, institutions were opening up to people of color. Julian Abel went to the University of Pennsylvania to study architecture.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it wasn't totally segregated, but anyway, because it was segregated, it really developed this very rich culture. And then by the middle of the 20th century, other places began opening up to Black people, and they began moving to other better off, newer neighborhoods, you could say. And the neighborhood went into a very bad decline after World War II because Blacks were going to better neighborhoods, maybe to the suburbs. And that neighborhood was in really, really bad shape for a long time. And it's just recently, I guess, being gentrified. I mean, there still is a sizable Black population there. Because there is so much new construction in Philadelphia right now and so much gentrification that a lot of developers or housing developers are coming in and tearing down the old houses and building new ones. And they really just wanton destruction. And I can't say that the new houses are, if they last 30 years, we'll be lucky. I mean, they're replacing these really handsome Victorian brick and stone houses with these metal clad, boxes. It's really terrible. And the city has some financial incentives, pouring gasoline on the fire. And at the same time, we have a historical commission that is very, very pokey and slow. And there's only just been a realization in the U.S. that we need to pay more attention to architecture from the, non-dominant white culture. So, preservationists are only just catching up with this idea that there are buildings that were important to Black communities, to Native American, indigenous communities, to ethnic Jewish or Italian communities that are really, really important. Preservation is complicated because some buildings get preserved because they're exemplars of their architectural period. And then other buildings get preserved because of the culture and history that they were part of. And so it gets trickier in making judgments about what should be preserved if it's not just purely aesthetics. Anyway, we are starting to get better at this. So I came to write about this neighborhood because I was horrified by these demolitions. And when the house next to the one Julian Abel lived in was slated for demolition, I was just horrified because it was a perfectly intact Victorian row. Every house had a cornice. There was all this detailing around the windows and stone, what we call water tables at the base. it wasn't like the greatest, buildings of the time, but it was just this beautiful, sort of rich red brick ensemble that had survived through so many periods of difficulty and somehow remained intact. And then some developer comes along and yanks one out of the middle of the row, like, a bad tooth, and was about to put up this, really banal building. So I began writing about that and about one of the things I'm interested in, what are the forces that are driving these kinds of things. So I talked a bit about the tax incentives, the lack of preservation, the lack of research into this neighborhood. And I wrote a couple of articles, and then I'm very happy to say the local, there's a Preservation Alliance, which is a nonprofit group that lobbies for preservation. They hired a couple of researchers who did a really quick study of the neighborhood and its importance and put together what we call a historic nomination. I mean, they did it so fast, but they really did like amazing research, and they uncovered a lot of these important historical figures, and they really painted this amazing portrait of this whole community. I mean, because people were fairly prosperous, a lot of the men were professionals. That meant their wives could stay home and raise the children and take them to after school activities and all this like social world. It was very little is known about a kind of middle class Black life in America. We hear a lot about really poor Black people, but we don't hear about these achievers that much. It was just fascinating research, and it just painted such a rich picture of this community, which was really just right outside the very center of the city. You could walk to the downtown business district from this neighborhood. I always loved that Julian Abel, he worked for a white architect called Horace Trumbauer, and he would walk to his office in the downtown. Philadelphia is a very walkable place, and so I just like to imagine Julian Abel like going off every morning to his office, where he designed these amazing museums and cultural buildings. And Marion Anderson, this very famous concert singer, just lived a couple blocks away. And a guy named Reverend Charles Tindley, who had a very big church, and he's famous for writing the song "We Shall Overcome."
Oh, yeah.
He lived on the same block. I mean, you just cannot believe how many notable people could live on one or two blocks within a short distance of each other. Doctors and lawyers and politicians. It was the premier, couple of blocks for the Black community at that period. Even though there have been a number of demolitions, really unfortunate ones, that has all now been stopped through the actions of the city council person representing that district. He put a moratorium on the demolitions while this preservation nomination is being completed. So I think they will save, some fabric. The complicating aspect of this, and, this is also worthy of discussion, is, as I mentioned, the neighborhood has been gentrifying in recent years, and it's become whiter again. And some people are, asking quite reasonably, who are we preserving this for?
Yeah.
There are a lot of complicated issues in preservation. It's really hard to preserve the community, easier to preserve buildings.
Yeah. There's something, just as a side note, you said the person who wrote "We Shall Overcome" stayed in the neighborhood. And in India, very interestingly, we have our own version of the song in Hindi. So a lot of us have grown up being
right?
extremely familiar. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's called "Hum Honge Kamyab." We will succeed, or we will, well, quite literally, we shall overcome.
That is amazing.
Yeah. It's traveled.
Well, his name was Charles Tindley, and he was a pastor. And his church was also walking distance from this street. It's a magnificent church, still exists today. I heard that in its heyday, it had like 10,000 people.
Oh, wow.
Who went to that church. And of course, I'm sure you know, and I'm sure your listeners know, that We Shall Overcome was the anthem of the civil rights movement in the U.S.
Yeah.
Reverend Martin Luther King, would sing that during marches. So it's a really important song, and it was written right here in his house. His house wasn't even on the historic register. That's how much we overlook that part of our history.
I've never been to Philadelphia, but while I was doing my research, it seems like there are a lot of initiatives and organizations in Philadelphia working towards raising a certain kind of awareness in the city about preservation, or working quite literally towards, advocating for better preservation practices in the city. So, of course, you referred us to the work of, I'm forgetting his name, who's the director of the preservation program at UPenn.
Oh, Randall Mason. Yeah.
Yes, Randall Mason, yes. And then we came across another organization called Monuments Lab.
Oh, yes.
And they've been doing some work as well. So to know that there's all these different actors involved in advocating for preservation, that it's probably giving rise to a certain movement, the effect of which hopefully we see immediately or a few years later. But gentrification is something that I think is happening worldwide, very sadly. And being from a city that is India's first World Heritage City, just the other week there was this one article of, we have something called the pole houses. So it's a very tight-knit urban fabric, which was essentially part of the fort walls. So the city was within the fort walls, and all the houses were designed in a way that extremely climate responsive, very close-knit, narrow streets. So the streets would be shaded. The houses were, working perfectly with the weather and the climate. And there's this one beautiful house in the old city. I think it was because it's a UNESCO World Heritage City, a Grade 2 building, if I'm not wrong. I could be, but
What kind of building?
So UNESCO has all these different grades that they assign to buildings of architectural or heritage importance. So there's Grade 1 buildings, which are like, it leads to all kinds of policies in terms of the changes that can be made to it or the kind of attention. So I think it was a Grade 2 building. So still architecturally very significant, had merits to the way it was built. And because of some kind of an oversight or ignorance, it was literally just razed down overnight.
Really?
Wiped off, yeah. And then everybody, of course, suddenly wakes up once it's razed down, but it's gone.
Was that a private developer or the city, or which entity tore it down?
I think a combination of the two. I think it was bought by somebody, and then it was reported by someone that, there was like lack of maintenance or something, and it was eventually bulldozed by the city, if I'm not wrong. But it's so ironic because the city does have a heritage cell, and there seems to be just like a lack of communication between the city authorities that raised the building and then the city authorities which are actually working towards preservation. Like it's coming from the same letterhead almost. So I do get it in terms of how these questions of preservation often get very tricky and very intermingled with larger issues that your work especially also focuses around questions and issues of urban planning. You've written a lot about city planning, about bike lanes, parks, skyscrapers, museums.
It's all connected. Everything is connected.
And I get it because you see when, of course, housing is one form of what happens when neighborhoods get gentrified, but there's also a lot of these like other cultural institutions which come in. And of course, as a city grows and as infrastructure changes, there are all these amenities that enter into the plan. But where do you see the intersection of preservation and urban planning? I'm thinking about it more in terms of this like very wide, complicated nexus of public memory and then questions of identity and place. And I'm wondering how preservation can be extended to the scale of a city without, of course, marking it as, UNESCO World Heritage or, without giving any labels.
Yeah. Philadelphia is technically a World Heritage something. not the whole city, but
Right.
the area where the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were written. That whole historic colonial area is a World Heritage Site. So, there are a lot of competing interests right now, and I'm sure you have the same ones in India. There's a huge demand for housing. Philadelphia is very big in land area, and as I said, most people live in these sort of row houses or townhouses. Some can be quite small, some can be bigger. So it's medium density. I mean, as American cities go, it's quite dense, but there are people who have been advocating for more density, and that's why they want to tear down these houses and put up apartment buildings. They say create more affordable housing. I'm a little suspicious of that because we have a lot of vacant land here. I feel that we could go a long way to satisfying our housing needs by building on the vacant land and repairing existing houses. Philadelphia, which has about 1.6 million people, we have some housing pressure, but like if you've heard about San Francisco or New York or Boston, where prices are really crazy and middle-class people can't afford to buy, houses, that's not our situation here. If you earn a middle-class salary, you can buy a house here or rent a house. We have a lot of poverty, and so it's more of a problem for very poor people, but not because the housing doesn't exist, but because they can't afford it. So the issues are complicated. But, I'm of the belief that, first of all, an existing house, has all this embodied energy, and it's better for the climate to reuse it. And then secondly, I would argue that an existing house is always going to be more affordable than a new house because new houses are expensive. And maybe you've heard of this group called the YIMBYs, which is Yes in My Backyard. They're very pro-development. They're always arguing that the way to get more affordable housing is just to build like crazy. But all the new housing that's built is not, very little of it is affordable. It's expensive. So I would argue that existing housing is more affordable and better for the environment. And then, going to the question of preservation, Philadelphia is a very humanely scaled and walkable city. It's a grid city like New York, but with narrower streets and just very, very cozy streets with houses on both sides, very orderly. It's very humane and wonderful place. And it's very green. We have, trees lining the streets. I think that's, apart from whether the building is great or not great, I think those qualities are worth preserving. And also there's so many layers of history because, like all American cities, there have been waves of immigrants that have come here, that have left their mark, their culture. There's a neighborhood in what we call South Philadelphia, the southern part of the city, that was once heavily, heavily Italian. And when these immigrants came, they built these banks, to help other immigrants. And they always built the banks on the corners with like a curved facade to face so that you could see the bank from both directions. And, it's no longer an Italian neighborhood or, only marginally Italian, but all those banks with their curved facades and their, sort of Renaissance style stonework is still there. So you can see this past, the city's past. Now that neighborhood's kind of gentrified and there's all kinds of ethnicities living there, but you can see the layers of Italian culture in that city. And, I think this is what makes Philadelphia great, just the layers and layers of time that if you know how to read the buildings, if you know what to look for, you can just see, you can stand on a corner and see multiple eras of time. So few cities in America, have this. New York is torn down so much. Boston is torn down so much. Philadelphia is one of the oldest cities in the United States, and we have so much. And maybe because we have so much, we're like omnibod. We're so casual about like tearing down. We just think, oh, we'll have another one. But it's, I think Philadelphia's greatness comes from its ensembles. I always hate the idea of preserving just one building, like one lone tooth. To really understand the city, you have to have ensembles. And that gets back to the story of Black Doctors Row, because part of what it made it so wonderful and so evocative was the ensemble quality. And once you shoehorn in this, 21st century building that's a different color with completely different aesthetics, it's so glaring. Not that I'm opposed to building, new. I love modern architecture, and I do think you have to be somewhat sensitive to the context, and there's lots of clever ways to do that.
When you're talking about preserving an ensemble and not preserving something in isolation, there's just every single time there's this one image that pops up in my head. It's from this beautiful movie called Up, and it's a very provocative image. It's very profound how both of them are living in this tiny little house because they refuse to sell that plot of land, and it was their dream house. Everything around it is torn down. There's like heavy construction going around, and there's all these like huge cranes and a lot of, construction workers. Everybody's going in and out, and it's just Carl and Ellie. I don't know. I think the wife's name is Ellie. She's passed away, and Carl is an old widower who's been staying in the house because he has memories of his wife out there. So before he flies away, he puts balloons to the house. It's this image that always comes to my mind. How do we really look at it beyond the importance of one particular building and know that you cannot take away everything else and have like a lone survivor in the middle of everything? I mean, we're not looking at it as a museum. You're not having a building as an artifact while everything else is changing. We're looking at it more as, living cities that somehow have life into them and not just abandoned downtowns that are just like nice for walking.
Historic preservation is very challenging because there are, you have to tease out a lot of subjective feelings you have. One of the good things that the U.S. did was they developed a set of standards. I think there are 10 standards that are supposed to guide preservation. They're called the Secretary of the Interior Standards. And so when the process is working well, the Historical Commission will get a nomination, which will have a long narrative describing the architectural qualities and the history of the building and the cultural history. And then they'll make an argument based on the 10 standards. Here's why this building should be preserved. And then the commission, which is made up of citizens, will discuss it and evaluate it. And, reasonable people can differ on what is worthy of preservation. But I think when you have that framework of standards, it can help guide you when you have clear objectives. Because sometimes people who love old buildings can get carried away and, they just love it because it's familiar. Sometimes I hate to see buildings that I've passed for 20 years torn down, even though I know they're nothing buildings. But, it's like, it's disruptive to my eye, but that's not a good standard. You have to be more rigorous than that. I think if you go about it in kind of a scientific way, not totally without any emotion, but a scientific way, and establish a framework and standards, you can kind of figure out what is worth preserving and how, and make judgments based on that.
And hopefully while doing that, we somehow try to include people from various backgrounds and various phases of life and different trainings and different professions to set out those frameworks. I mean, you, for example, have been so instrumental in a lot of dialogues around preservation that have happened in Philadelphia. And in our previous conversation, something you said, I mean, made me think a lot, because I won't say I'm a writer, but when I was in grad school, that's kind of what we did. We were studying history and philosophy of design, and the only medium that we used was the written word, primarily. I think the first time we spoke, you referred to yourself as an instigator and not necessarily an initiator. I wanted to talk about that a little bit and about the tags that are often attributed to you. You are a journalist, you are an architecture critic. I would also call you an advocate, if I may take that liberty.
I'm definitely an advocate.
However, I think at the crux of everything, you are a writer, and you use the power of the written word to raise awareness and drive change and create accountability among, people in the city and people who are responsible for the cities that we live in. I understand, of course, that at the end of the day, the scope of our influence as writers is directly connected to the audience one is reaching out to, but you're still recording a context, a place, a specific time, and creating what will become evidence or an archive for the future. And that, to me, is very powerful. What are your thoughts on the agency of a writer in shaping cities?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important, because by putting things into words, we understand them. I think what a writer does is give you give your readers the language to articulate and understand very complex events that are going on around them and to situate them in a context. Now, I should say I'm not just a writer, I'm a journalist. That's a specific category of writer. I mean, for one thing, I'm a trained reporter. In the United States, reporters tend not to be participants, but observers. So, I wouldn't lead a rally to save a building. Somebody else would do that.
Yeah.
I also have the privilege of working for the largest media entity in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Inquirer. So I have a pretty big platform. It's not a niche platform. It's a general interest newspaper and website. So I do my advocacy as an observer. I also have the ability to call up public officials and ask them questions. I go to meetings. I interview a lot of different people, and I take all that research and incorporate it into my columns, which are written from my point of view. I'm not what they call a straight news reporter, but I'm a columnist. So but at the same time, I work like a straight news reporter in the sense that I gather information from all sides, from public records, and then I sort of filter it through the prism of my point of view, and then I present an argument. That's been my strategy. And, I might write about other advocates. There are a lot of preservation advocates here and their work. When I mentioned this historical nomination for Black Doctors Row, that was prepared by a nonprofit group. And I wrote about that group. And they were, when they did that nomination, they were actually responding to my reporting, because I sort of raised the alarms about this neighborhood. And then they had the specialized knowledge and historians to do that research and to put together that nomination. So I revealed what was happening. The nonprofit responded. Politician recognized the importance and acted to freeze the demolitions. So, all these, what we might call the estates, like the Fifth Estate, all came together in this interplay between government, NGOs, the media, individual citizen advocates.
Mm.
So that's a good example of how I think democracy is supposed to work in a local democracy. Doesn't always work like that, and of course that nomination hasn't gotten a hearing yet, but I'm hopeful that it will. But yeah, I do as a columnist, I definitely see myself as an advocate, and like just from the moment I choose what to write about and how I present it, it's a very conscious argument based on my worldview, my principles. But as I said, I'm not going to lead like some crowd to City Hall to protest. Somebody else could do that.
But Inga, speaking of nominations, you are a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and you were nominated twice before you...
I was nominated 3 times, or I was a finalist 3 times. I didn't win, and then on the 4th time, I finally won. Yeah.
So that speaks volumes about the kind of reporting you've been doing and the kind of work you've been doing. My very nosy self is extremely interested in knowing what's in the pipeline and what's next for you and what's next for preservation in Philadelphia.
Well, it's a big struggle, preservation in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia, after a long period of decline, is growing again, and there is a lot of housing development and gentrification that's often at odds with preservation. And money drives everything. There's a lot of money to be made in construction. The city wants to see this construction. The city wants to see growth. They want to see more taxes. Sympathetic to that, certainly. And so it's very, very easy to sacrifice its old buildings. And so it's a very difficult dance that is going on right now. Our current mayor campaigned saying he was going to be a preservationist, and he has not been a preservationist at all, unfortunately, because it's very easy to be seduced by all this development and growth, and it's hard to resist. And then the gentrification part, as I mentioned, this was a very segregated city. A lot of Black neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that are on the front lines of gentrification. People there would tend to earn less money. It's very tempting for them to sell their houses and, take what money they can. And then, developers come in. That's been an issue. What happens to the community when the community is broken up like that? I mean, people talk about preserving the community, not just here in Philadelphia, but I mean, what's happening with Black neighborhoods here is happening, all over the country and Latino neighborhoods. And, it's kind of a hopeless task in a way to, quote, preserve community, because communities are always changing. I mentioned a neighborhood that used to be Italian, then it was Jewish, then it was, something else. That's kind of the story of America, that we have all these, nothing is permanent here. Maybe in other countries it is, but, Americans are very mobile. That's our strength and our weakness at the same time. So that's a big issue for preservation is, when the community disappears, then what are we preserving? I mean, I think the fabric, the style of housing, they're also important, no matter who's occupying them. So I think that's one thing in the future. And there's so many issues here to write about. I think climate change is a big issue for how we build.
Yeah.
Of course, the climate, and yet another climate conference is happening right now in Scotland.
The G20.
Yeah. Boy, we really, really deal with this issue in how we build, the materials we use, how we use streets, and how we treat the automobile and how we treat transit. how we treat the low-lying land near rivers. For a long time, I was a big advocate of building along our rivers because they had previously been industrial, and then when the industry went away, they were just vacant land. And I thought, oh, a big city needs a beautiful waterfront, development. Now I'm beginning to ask, really, should we be building there at all? Because it's going to flood.
Yeah.
There was just a bad hurricane that came through Philadelphia, and the water came within a half block of my house.
Oh, wow.
I live about, I want to say, maybe 600 feet, 800 feet from the river. And I would say the water came about less than 100 feet from my house. And I have a community garden plot in a community garden on the river. And my community garden was under 4 feet of water. Yeah, my neighbors had their basements flooded. And, well, I'm sure you know about this stuff in India. It was terrible. It was just terrible. I don't know in the history of my neighborhood if we've ever seen that amount of flooding. So I think, one of the things we have to talk about is, maybe we shouldn't be building so close to the river. Maybe we should just keep that a floodable area with parks. You can build parks on the river that can flood and can be managed and can absorb floodwaters. I know that's a big issue in India, maintaining the mangrove groves, right?
Yeah, they're dying at a very rapid rate.
Yeah. And they've been mitigation against flooding. So I think that's a big issue when you're writing about cities now and heat islands and tree cover are really, really important issues. We have, we still build surface parking lots in Philadelphia. I don't think we can do that anymore because they are immense heat islands, and we have poor neighborhoods with no tree cover. So those are the kinds of things we have to deal with and figure out ways that we have a pretty good transit system in Philadelphia, but not good enough. And anyone who gets any money wants to buy a car. Sure, you have that problem in India too. And all that driving and parking and street space is really contributing very heavily to climate change. So, it's funny, when I started out as an architecture critic, I never thought I'd be writing about that sort of thing. But
the question is it something that can be avoided, or is it something that we cannot not talk about regardless of what we're doing in our lives, because it is at the center stage of pretty much all human activity at this point. There's no running away from it.
Well, we have to talk about it. I mean, people are very short term, obviously. People, anytime I say something bad about cars, someone will write me an email and say, but I need to park. I need to pick up my groceries. I need to do this. I understand. But, if we never make sacrifices, we're never going to stop this. I'm a big bicycle advocate, by the way.
Yeah, I read. And you've been advocating for a lot of bicycle lanes and in the way streets are designed and the way the new planning policies are implemented. That's something they've been trying to do in India since a really long time. I mean, of course, recreational cycling is a thing. You'd see a lot of people in the morning going for biking just as a way of exercise. But as you said, anybody who has any kind of money will want to buy a car. And I'm guilty of that. I'm not saying I bike my way to office or anything, but there's some kind of a correlation between wealth and prosperity and owning cars versus having bikes, and that not being a symbol of you doing probably that well in your life. So
right, yeah.
You get looked down upon if you're biking somewhere. I mean, of course, that change asks for a larger change in the way we as society think about modes of transportation and sustainability, but
I mean, it's interesting that in the Netherlands and in Denmark, which are both very prosperous countries, like everybody bikes. So it's funny how you get to a certain level of prosperity and then you embrace the bike.
And then it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the good part is, we are living in this delivery economy, for better or worse, and you can have anything delivered. So maybe every single person doesn't have to get in the car and drive to the grocery store. Maybe these delivery vans can deliver them, and maybe they would be electric, so maybe that's a solution, because, obviously some things are heavy. You can't put them on a bike, but we could explore, more hybrid forms of transportation, I think. And that could be helpful and also very convenient. It just takes a little, it's hard to change your habits.
Apparently 21 days is all it takes, but I don't think so.
Is that what they say? 21 days to change your habits?
Yeah, well, we'll see. I think there's a lot to be thought about, and I think your use of the word delivery economy sets me off on a different tangent, but that's something for me to think about more. Well, Inga, thank you so very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope we'll see each other either in Ahmedabad or Philadelphia or someplace in between.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the design and research support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Arc of Center, and we would also love to hear from you. So drop in a hi at our website arcoffcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thanks for listening.